Generally, it's not a good idea to talk about sex, religion, or politics. Well, on today's Medics Money podcast, we're going to break this convention. Those of you who are watching on YouTube will be relieved to hear that we're not going to be talking about sex, but we are going to be talking about politics. And we are going to go through 5 financial changes we would like to see in the manifestos to help healthcare workers. And to do this, we are joined by Cyra. Hi, Cyra.
Hi there, Tommy. I'm Cyra. I'm part of the Medics Money team.
Whoa. You got to big yourself up. Like, first of all, you're Dr. Cyra Asher. Like, give it the full...
Sorry. My name is Cyra. I'm a doctor currently on my F3 in A&E, and I'm also a chartered accountant.
Matthew?
Morning, Tommy. My name's Matthew. I'm not qualified in any meaningful way, apart from being a level 4 financial advisor and a manager and producer of the Medics Money podcast.
Whoa. So you've got the DIP FA, which means that you could, in theory, work as a financial advisor. You got a degree in economics. You hang out with the best of the best at Medics Money. So come on, big yourselves up. Also, this is the earliest I've ever seen you up, Matthew. So you're obviously interested in today's topic. It is quite early. Okay, nice. And finally, Andy, who is currently on holiday, but as commitment to the podcasting cause, you get the gold star today, Andy.
Yeah, thanks, Tommy. I'm Andy. I am a chartered accountant and a long-time advisor of doctors in all forms. And I've been working in Medics Money now for a year and a bit now.
Nice. Right, let's just get straight into it because these are basically what we would like to see in the manifestos of the various parties in order to help the NHS and healthcare workers in general. Now, we are recording this on the day the manifestos come out, so we haven't actually seen them yet, but there's been a few leaks. So let's just get into the first topic that we're going to talk about, and that is the problem with student loans. Now, Cyra and Matthew, you've done a great podcast about this. I definitely recommend. Is that on our other channel, other podcast? Okay, so What Medical School Doesn't Teach Us podcast. We'll put a link to that. But who wants to open up with this? Because I think this is big.
Yeah, I'll go first as the person who hasn't had a student loan. So
so smug.
I come from that lucky age group who went through university and we didn't have to borrow anything, and we started a job and therefore didn't have to repay these loans. And the more I've looked into it and the more I've actually talked over and listened to the podcast that was done by younger doctors, you realise what a massive problem this is. You know, with the interest rates being charged on the loans at the moment, most people won't be paying enough just to cover the interest. So they're going to just see their loans grow and grow and grow, which essentially means they've got a graduate tax. It's not a loan anymore. It's a graduate tax of 9% going on for the whole of their career. And I think that's just... It's not great. It's not great for education. It's not great for supporting people through making the right choices and the right commitments in life, in my view. And unfortunately, it's something that came up in the last 14 years of the current government, which is not something to be proud of, I think, as a country.
Cyra?
Yeah, thank you, Andy. That's actually spot on. And like you say, it's added a kind of burden I don't think anyone really expected. I think at the time, and it happened so insidiously as well, because a lot of things started off as bursaries and then they became loans, and they transitioned a lot of things from initially it was all bursary, and then they said, oh, this proportion is going to be a loan, so you only have to pay that little bit back. And then now it's become entirely loans, to the extent that even the NHS bursary, which for the penultimate and final years for medical students doing the undergraduate degree, part of it is now a loan from the student loans company, whereas it used to be entirely a bursary before. So it's now insidiously even going into the NHS bursary side of things, which is really unfortunate because other healthcare professionals didn't have that problem for a little while. It's now causing problems because if you did a different allied healthcare professional qualification, all of that was bursary to improve recruitment, but doctors never got that either. So doctors are not only paying the most, I'd say, because of the way that the pay increase works, because it's so low to begin with, we don't pay enough for us to actually cut into a chunk of that loan, so that by the time we're actually a high earners, that's towards the end of our career, we're still never going to be able to pay it off. But maybe we will because of the 9% of being of the high pay, but we're going to be paying it off very close to the end of that 30-year/40-year cutoff. It's not going to be one of those where we're going to be able to wipe it off. early on, unless we've got a huge chunk of money, which we've got different opinions on what to do there.
Yeah, and I think it's great to have different generations on this, because there are a lot of people like Andy who never had a student loan. And if you've never had one, you just can't appreciate what a 9% graduate tax on your earnings above 27,295, I think it is, if you're on, depends on the plan, do your own research. But anyway, it's a graduate tax of 9%. It's going to cost doctors disproportionately more because of the way our salaries start super low and then eventually maybe one day go up over time, by which time your debt's got so massive that you'll never pay it off and you're just stuck with a 9% graduate tax. I'd also like to shout that it does really affect the nurses, which is what Cyra was alluding to. What do we want them to do here, right? Because me and Cyra did a podcast on something called student loan forgiveness, which is really popular in America, which the basic concept is that you mess up this massive student loan becoming a doctor, but that is, or nurse, and that is hugely beneficial to society. And so if you do service in the American NHS equivalent thereof, or what, public service, I'm not exactly sure how it works, you get your loan essentially written off. And the Nuffield Foundation did a kind of think tank thing on this, saying we should consider forgiving student loans of people that work in the NHS, and essentially the longer you work in the NHS, the more of your loan you get written off. Is that what we want to see, or what are we asking for in the manifesto?
I would have liked any mention of it, to be honest. That would have been nice. They haven't addressed it at all. Yes, when we did our podcast, we talked about the student loan forgiveness, and I think I saw some comments on the YouTube channel, and people were saying that they'd be more pro than con for the student loan forgiveness. It would go some way to restoring some goodwill from doctors and nurses than we have now, because at the moment we're paying so much out of our own pocket for the pleasure of working for sub-inflationary pay. So it would have been nice for the student loan to be mentioned at all, but the student loan forgiveness, I think, would go a long way into getting people to go into those kinds of degrees, because at the moment, the way the degree or the way the student loan structure works, it either tempts people to go to university for the sake of it, but then staying in a fairly low paying job, because then they won't pay off the student loan and it can just get written off, or it puts off really bright people from going to university to do really high paying jobs because of the amount of debt they're going to end up in, and the fact that the student loan is known to be not able to meet the cost of living crisis at the moment anyway. So some mention of it would have been good.
Yeah, I was going to jump in and say, if we assume that the average graduate salary maybe is 28,000, lowering the repayment threshold to 25,000, as with Plan 5 student loans, means you're paying an awful lot more for basically no more increase in your starting salary once you graduate. And like Cyra and Andy was saying earlier, compounded by the fact that there's basically no sense in paying it back early. You might think with some other types of debt, like credit card debt, there's a lot of benefit to paying it off early. With student loans, unless you're starting, I saw your graph, Tommy, between 70 and 90 or something, there's essentially no point in you making those early repayments. You just won't be able to keep pace with the RPI plus 3%. Is that Plan 2, and then maybe just RPI on Plan 5. Correct me if I'm wrong, Cyra, but you just can't keep pace with it unless you're some sort of miracle worker.
It's probably something we'll talk about later. I mean, yes, the only thing I've heard about student loans was actually Keir Starmer saying they won't be able to do anything about it because of the state of the economy, and that's it really. But it's interesting because we'll come and talk about pension tax relief and lifetime and annual allowance tax charges later, where they are doing something about that. And to me, again, it's a bit embarrassing being the older generation here, in that lifetime allowance is the bit that affects you at the end of your career when you've done quite well and we've had all these other benefits. And I would just like to see something actually reflective of people at the start of their careers and giving them a better chance.
Yeah, student loan is super complicated. Matthew made a really good point at the end there, which is that the student loan is unlike other loans like credit cards and stuff. So overpaying doesn't necessarily, or in almost all senses, doesn't make sense. So do your own research, do your own numbers, but just be aware. Like, listen to Matthew and Cyra's podcast. It was awesome. It sounds like Andy learned a bit from it too. Okay, let's move on then to something, again, which we've been banging on about for absolutely years. Ed calls it stealth taxation. Andy, can you explain? Because I think this is a great stealth tax, because every budget, they're like, no, we're not putting up income tax, but we've just frozen the allowance. Doesn't sound that bad, does it? And then Ed's just doing his nut in the corner because he just can't believe that they're doing it again. So can you explain, like, in Ed's absence, because he's on holiday, I hope you're having a nice time, mate, but what is this freezing of allowances and why is it a problem?
So essentially what happens in the tax system is you get your tax-free personal allowance, which is the bit you don't pay any tax on, and then the next chunk of income you pay at 20%, the next chunk at 40%, and eventually get up to 45%. Different rates apply in Scotland. For anyone listening in Scotland, they pay more tax earlier on. But essentially the bands these things change at have been frozen. They've been frozen now for quite a few years, and the plan is to freeze them at least to 2028. And I haven't seen any of the discussion so far in the election campaign about anyone really saying they're going to change them. So effectively what that means is as inflation goes on and you get pay increments just purely because of inflation, you're getting less. You're going to end up paying more tax on that because it's going to push more and more people into the various bands. And there's particularly horrible bands where you end up paying an awful lot of tax. And the biggest one by far is the 100,000 level one, where you start to lose a tax-free personal allowance, you start to lose tax-free childcare allowances, quite a few other things kick in at that point in time. And that's been frozen. And that's been frozen. The 100,000 level, I think, has been frozen for pretty much 10 plus years now. It's not really changed. And if we looked at pure inflation, that would probably be more like 150,000 now, I guess. So it's quite it's a clever way of increasing tax revenue. And again, no one's really said anything about it. I mean, to be honest, the one person I did see something about it was Jeremy Hunt. And Jeremy Hunt said, this 100,000 level is causing us a problem now. I'd really like to do something about it. Jeremy, what have you been doing the last few years? What's your job been? It's really frustrating when they come out and say things like this. But the reality is, he probably knows he's not going to get into power. He's probably not going to get that chance to actually change it. He doesn't have to deal with the economic side of it, so he can probably say what he likes at the moment. But yeah, it's going to be a problem, and I suspect whichever government takes over, given the current state of the economy, unless the economy improves dramatically, Matthew might have something to say as an economist on that viewpoint. Not that I'm throwing you in there, Matthew, but unless we see a substantial increase, we're going to be stuck with these kind of fixed rates for a while.
Yeah.
Just adding to Andy, so what Andy's describing there is fiscal drag. And it's not just the income tax bands that are causing this fiscal drag either. More people are being dragged into paying tax in different ways, including a reduction in dividends allowance, reduction in capital gains tax allowance, the freezing of the ISA tax. So the ISA thing has been 20,000 for so long now. Considering that people are making more money, wanting to save more money tax-free and be more tax efficient, but can still only save up to 20,000 for so long, despite pay increases, they're being forced to pay more tax because they're going to be saving elsewhere, and any interest that they receive or dividends that they receive will be subject to tax. So the fiscal drag isn't just purely based on the income tax bands, it's also based on the fact that the other areas of life where people will try and make some savings or try and help with their future, they're being pulled into paying more tax there as well.
Yeah, I was going to say, it sounds like a good point for me to jump in with the Economist, here to make everyone happy, as it is called, the dismal science. Look, I've done a bit of research into it, and it's not amazing at the minute, sadly. There's a couple of reasons for why growth in Britain is quite dire at the minute. COVID obviously goes without saying. The war in Ukraine is pushing everyone's bills up, making it harder and harder, the cost of living. And finally, sadly, across a few industries, Britain is just very unproductive at the minute. And sadly, that includes the NHS. Now, the reason behind that, some would say maybe cuts in funding over the last decade. And that means that trusts in the NHS, instead of making key investments into equipment, staff, etc., they have to make up the shortfall in their budget from capital spending. That's what the Economist reports. Now, all of these kind of things become quite a big cocktail to explain why growth is pretty challenging. And I think it's going to be quite a key part of the manifestos, is they're trying to increase tax revenues through growth rather than giving us more allowances, I think. So if everyone's more well off, that percentage means they get more tax revenues. All of this is to reduce the government spending, borrowing as a percentage of GDP. But that inevitably means, I think the Economist reported, that there might be even more cuts to public spending. So, I mean, I don't know how the NHS is expected to take much more cuts. That's probably a separate issue, all of it in itself. But that's the overview. I mean, public services across Britain are in a bit of a dire way, across prisons, schools, the NHS notwithstanding. So I'd like to see something about public services, maybe a bit of a U-turn on this plans to axe more public funding, if possible.
I think to highlight that, there's breaking news this morning when we're recording this, is that the chair of Devon ICB has set out a number of tweets this morning about her resigning. And she actually used to be an ex-Conservative minister and an ex-Conservative health minister, but she's resigned on the grounds that she cannot accept the financial budget they're going to have to be working to, because it is not that she doesn't believe they can function in a way that is effective, which I think is quite an interesting political take on, and backs up really what Matthew's just said there.
Very
interesting. Rats leaving a sinking ship. Wait, did I say that out loud? Okay, let's move on to the third point, which is related to this freezing of allowances, right? Which is, again, something that we've been banging on at Medics Money for a long time. Marginal rates of tax. Who wants to explain the problem with marginal rates of tax? And then I've got a counterpoint to put to everyone, really.
So I did an article on marginal rates of tax. So and it was a depressing article to write. Basically, once you start hitting £100,000, the reason it's you think you're only paying the income tax bracket that you're hitting, which is going to be the 40%, because it's 45% above 125k, but it's not just 40%, because once you go over £100,000 of tax, you start to lose your personal allowance, which is usually the nil rate band of £12,570. But that £12,570 isn't paid at the lower rate of tax, it's paid at the higher rate of tax. And then you also start losing your tax-free childcare allowance. So this is the ability for parents to put, for every £8 of their own money that they put into this account, the government gives them £2, and then that can go towards approved childcare facilities. So that's gone. So you're losing that. And then you're also losing your childcare places. So your free childcare places in nursery, they go, and your child benefit goes as well. So all of those things means that you don't realize that you're paying more tax, but with all the added expense that comes, especially if you have children, that turns into a marginal rate of tax that's much, much higher than the 40% band that you thought you were in. Yeah,
my counterpoint for everybody here is we all want to see more investment in public services that could come from taxation. 100 grand is a lot of money. So I'm preempting the YouTube comments here by saying, if you're earning 100 grand, you deserve to pay more tax. Discuss.
I don't disagree with that, Tommy. I mean, ultimately, it depends on your political view in life, but my view is that if you earn more, you should contribute more because you can afford to. I think the problem is the way it's set up, as Cyra described, is you suddenly hit these points where it's not that you've gone from 40 to 45% tax, because if it went from 40 to 45% tax, most people will go, that's what it is. But it doesn't. It goes from 40% tax to 60% tax, or even Scotland, 67.5% tax, plus 2% national insurance, plus all the child-related stuff that Cyra talked about. And it's because of that, actually, it then becomes a driver to people stopping working, because actually there's no the incentive to doing more work and more sessions, particularly in the NHS. And we look at the new government is going to try and have to tackle the waiting list side of things. And particularly the Labour Party have put forward the view that they're going to do this by they want people to work more hours and work weekends and work in maybe in private hospitals to get this backlog down. Well, if they're earning more, if you're in one of these rates of tax, actually you're not going to be taking very much home, and it's not going to be a great incentive for people to work more. So my view would be we just have to have a more gradual system, and if that means the 45% band kicks in an early level of income to compensate for the lost revenue, that would be better, because people would then retain more of what they earned for doing the extra work.
I have to disagree with both of you, funnily enough. So I think the tax system in the UK is one of the most punitive. So not only are you paying so proportionally, if everybody paid 20% tax over the 12,570, those earning more will still pay more. So why do we have to be so punitive that even though people are earning more, they pay even more proportionally as well? Not just, so they're paying 40% and then 45%. So why do they have to do that when they'd be paying more anyway if everybody was on the same tax rate? Because you'd be paying 20% of your entire pay.
Massively disagree with you here, because you're forgetting about VAT. VAT is probably the most punitive tax that we've got, because it's paid by everyone that buys things. And people at the poorer levels, or the reduced income levels, poor is probably not the right word, reduced income levels, will spend more of their disposable income, and therefore, as a proportion of their income, will pay more VAT. So yeah, there's swings around about. I do get what you're saying, though, Cyra. You know that actually, I think what both of us agree on is people shouldn't be penalised for working, and that is what the system is doing at the moment.
Absolutely.
The economist ears are pricking up at the mention of a proposed flat rate taxation system from Cyra. Matthew, what have you got?
I was just trying to stay out of the blue corner versus red corner. I agree with Andy in terms of VAT punishing those on the lower kind of reduced income levels, and yeah, I mean that's all I can really say. I mean, there's definitely some kind of argument here. I can definitely say it more eloquently if I actually thought about it. But healthcare is a sort of good that doesn't really diminish from doing more, whereas the pay does diminish from doing more. Like the net good that a doctor would do from doing an extra couple of sessions. I mean, I did a module in healthcare economics. I think it's called like maybe quality adjusted life years. It's more for like drug interventions. But if you look at it like from that point of view, it's a massive good, and it doesn't diminish because the doctor does more sessions, whereas maybe it would in other industries. So I think there may be a more fair system needed to incentivise more work in the NHS. And I'm sorry I can't answer about the flat rate tax.
Like, from a lay person's point of view, that's me, the tax you pay has to reflect the effort that you put in, okay? And if you go over this £100,000 threshold, yeah, it's an amazing problem to have. £100,000 is a ton of money. But you could actually end up with a marginal tax rate of some of the calculations that Ed and Andy have done, nearly pushing 80%. And then you factor in losing your tax-free childcare, and you don't lose it like a taper. You go £1 over and you just lose the whole lot. It just makes no sense. We need a tax system that is progressive, in my view. Sorry, Cyra. But that doesn't penalise hard work. And this band from 100 to 125 makes zero sense. And if I was up against this, if I was a new consultant starting on £99,000 and they said to me, do you want to do a locum shift? And I had tax-free childcare, I would have to, this would be a consideration. And we've seen this too many times recently. We had it with the annual allowance. That was a tax on doing extra work could get you less than after tax than you would have if you'd done nothing. And that makes zero sense to me. I don't know why this is still a problem. I'm sure Jeremy's promising to fix it. I mean, I don't know what he's been doing for the last 14 years. I reckon Jeremy's a bit worried about his seat, so he might be in his constituency, because I haven't seen him for a long time on TV. So maybe he's trying to get something going at constituency level. It would be a shame to see him gone, obviously.
Yeah. I mean, Ed often points out that we're entering a period where the tax burden is the highest since 1948. And from the sound of it, with the government trying to reduce the government debt through raising taxes eventually, it's looking like it's fairly likely in some form or another, whether a fiscal drag or an outright rise. I mean, it's going to get even higher. And yeah, it's with the backdrop of long real-term pay cuts, especially for healthcare professionals over the last decade. I don't know where it leaves us, to be quite honest. And I thought it was quite a harrowing statistic, and it's not meant to put anyone down, right? But Britain's outlook at the minute is Britain's going to be, on average, poorer per person than Poland by 2030s, and that's nothing against Poland at all, but it's just a kind of slow decline. I mean, I think India overtook England recently in terms of GDP per person, so it's like a sinking ship all round in every kind of facet at the minute. Not to be too pessimistic.
That's cheery.
Yeah. Look, I'm on the pod.
The empire has fallen is basically what I'm hearing from that. Nice one. Cheers, Matthew. Let's move on to lifetime and annual allowance. Now, hopefully everybody's listening to this understands lifetime and annual allowance, but it is confusing. So can somebody, before we talk about what we wanted to happen with this, can somebody explain annual allowance and lifetime allowance to everybody, and then why it's a problem? And yeah, let's go from there. But let's start with the basics, please.
Okay, so I guess it falls to me. It's my domain, very much my domain. So annual allowance and lifetime allowance are two basically pension tax charges. And they're tax charges in relation to your pension scheme. The annual allowance gives you a maximum amount per year you can put into pension schemes. But for the purpose of the NHS scheme, which is what we're really interested in, it's not actually physically how much you put in, it's how much it grows. And there's basically a calculation that has stayed fixed for a number of years. In fact, stayed fixed ever since they brought it in, as far as I remember. And you look at the growth of the pension, beginning of the year versus the end of the year, you multiply that by a factor of 16, and that gives you deemed growth of which you compare against the allowance. Now, the good news is the allowance went up from 40,000 to 60,000, which is good. So a lot of people aren't going to be caught by this anymore, which is good news. There still will be, though, at the higher end, will still be people that have caught, and particularly consultants, again, looking to do extra work, have to be careful about that, because we then have a secondary level of income, which is high, where that allowance has come down. So, yeah, from the annual allowance viewpoint, it's gone up, which is good, but it's still a ridiculously stupid calculation. It is still very complicated. It relies on the NHS actually being able to, NHS pensions being able to provide the data accurately, and to be fair on them, relies on the data going into them being accurate as well. So it's not just the pension side of the problem, it's everyone has to do things right in the system. And it's not a tax that people really understand particularly well. So my viewpoint, I'd love the annual allowance to disappear, because or go to a level where it doesn't become a problem in the NHS anymore. Because again, it was stopping people working. And those people that stopped working, unfortunately, really haven't returned, because once you stop, you rarely get back on the bicycle again and start pedaling again at the faster rate. That's what happens. The lifetime allowance.
Speak for yourself there, Andy. I resent that implication. But anyway, let's move on from the cycling analogy.
Yeah, but you've stopped cycling. You haven't stopped cycling, have you, Tommy? I think if you took up, I don't know, Crown Green bowls or something like that, you wouldn't go back to cycling as quickly, because you'd be used to the slower pace of life. Lifetime allowance is basically a secondary tax charge, or was a secondary tax charge. It was a tax on where your pension pot grew to. The good news for that is that Jeremy Hunt abolished it. Well, abolished it. There's still a level that does still exist for tax-free lump sums, but he abolished it. Labour were going to bring it back in, but Labour have decided not to bring it back in. That doesn't surprise me, because actually the concept of once it's gone and trying to bring it back in again was going to be very, very difficult for them to do, because it's unfair to penalise people retrospectively. People make decisions, you then have to put protections in place, and they were then going to talk about putting something different in place for doctors and higher earning medics to protect them, which would have caused chaos, and we've seen what's happened with McLeod and discrimination cases. That was just going to be a classic discrimination case. You're giving doctors this great allowance, why aren't you giving it to us just because I'm not a doctor? I think it would have led them down a path they wouldn't have been able to achieve what they want to do. So yeah, the lifetime allowance is gone. Doesn't look like it's coming back in the short term. I don't think, though, Labour have been definitive that it won't come back at full stop in the long term, or they will do something with that. And I think, going back to what we said previously about if the economy isn't doing so well, we need to raise tax revenue. All the parties have come out saying, the key two main parties have come out saying we're not going to increase our tax rates, our income tax rates. We're not going to increase our VAT tax rates. The only way then to try and do that is to sort of increase some of these extra tax rates, like capital gains tax or inheritance tax, or looking at the release we get. And pension tax relief may be something that has to come onto the agenda at some point in time. So yeah, it's an interesting U-turn by Labour, but not surprising to me personally.
That was an excellent explanation of the issues, and I'm looking uncomfortable because I'm stretching out my quads from a savage bike ride yesterday, so maybe I will be taking up bowls soon. The way that it was worded from Rachel Reeves, who announced it, was that basically, right, do you think this was like an ideological thing that they probably wanted to do, but when they looked at how ridiculously complicated it was going to be to reintroduce, that was why they abandoned it? Or what do you think about that? We're trying to be apolitical here, but I think it's an ideological thing that they thought this is good with our core voters, but then actually they looked at it and sensibly thought, it's going to be a nightmare to reintroduce.
There's a bit of they've had a very much a knee-jerk reaction after the budget where Jeremy Hunt brought it in or started to abolish it. And they said at that point in time, we're going to bring it straight back in again. We disagree with it. And I think as time has gone on, it's gone, it's a bit tricky. And to be fair, I think Labour are going to be playing it safe for the next part of the election, really, because if you believe the polls, then they look like they're going to be the government of choice. We could fall flat on our faces in a few weeks' time on this podcast if people listen to it and they haven't been elected. So I think they were just going to remove all the bits that are controversial from their possible budget for anyone to actually go, you're raising taxes, you're doing this. That's why I say I think they're probably going to end up parking this and look at things in the whole. And I think that's a reasonable thing to do, because you've got to weigh up pension tax relief rates, you've got to weigh up lifetime allowance, you've got to weigh up annual allowance, how they all affect things, how they motivate people through work, particularly in areas where you want them to work, like the NHS. And I think it's probably better to step back and think about things and actually bring in something down the line which is more reasonable that everyone can accept.
Yeah, good summary. The only other thing that I would say is I often see doctors getting the annual allowance, which is a ridiculously punitive, savage and ridiculous tax, in my view, confused with the lifetime allowance, which is not the lifetime limit. It's called the lifetime allowance. In my view, it's not as punitive as the annual allowance for various different reasons. It's not taxed at your marginal rate. So even if it does come back, just remember it's called the lifetime allowance, not the lifetime limit. Do you want to react to that bombshell, or can we move on to point 5?
Well, I just say, I mean, if we are ultimately going to limit tax relief on pensions, to me, this is my personal view, actually having a lifetime allowance to the maximum the pot can grow to is the sensible one, because actually you can measure that, you can see you're getting close to that, you can decide what you're going to do if you start to go over that allowance. And it doesn't stop your pension growth, it just means you pay some tax on that pension growth. Whereas the annual allowance is actually a tax on working, and it affects people now, what they're committed to do. So I prefer people to be working more, pay more tax under whatever system, because they'll be earning more, not restricted by the pensions annual allowance tax viewpoint, but ultimately we need to cap it at the maximum it can grow to. And not everyone will agree with that, but that's my view.
We'll have a financial advisor in the YouTube comments who mainly works with defined contribution pensions, i.e. not the NHS, saying that the way that lifetime allowance is calculated for the NHS pension is preferable to the way it's calculated for a non-NHS pension. So we're just going to tip our hat to that acknowledgement and not react, but move on. Andy's smirking. I think he wants to react, but I'm not going to let him. Point 5. I think we might have saved the worst to last here, which is pay and industrial action. Cyra, this is you. Come on, give it to us.
So doctors have been striking for the last nearly a year now, because our pay has, I think now the figure's around 32%, is now 32% less in real terms than what it was from 2008 onwards. And consultants, for example, their pay has been eroded by 25%, but they've accepted an agreement with the government that we haven't really had an agreement yet. Okay. So the problem we have as junior doctors is that our pay isn't much better than those graduating in other professions.
I think Cyra's dropping out.
It grows much slowly, it's sub-inflationary, and our buying power has significantly reduced because of other factors such as the cost of living crisis, increase in house prices, increase in mortgage rates. So because of that, it's not just the impact on the figure of the number itself, but what junior doctors anticipated their life looking like when they first decided to become doctors. And so the strikes are a mixture of things. They're not about pay solely. They're about the working conditions that junior doctors are put under, the 2016 contract that was imposed on them. All of those things are incorporated into the strikes.
Your sound dropped out a little bit there, but I think on the recording it will be okay. So, yeah, great summary of the issues. And what's the latest? Because this has been rumbling on for a while. What do we want to see in a manifesto from them?
You're not going to see anything in any manifesto about this. Absolutely no way is anyone going to put anything in manifesto. But whoever gets elected is problem number one on day one. They're going to have to deal with it. They're going to have to deal with junior doctors. The nursing unions have come out saying, look, we haven't actually agreed anything either. We want it back on the agenda on day one. You've got GPs heading towards some form of, not industrial action, but some form of working to rule and restricting what they're doing because of what's going on in terms of their contract. And you can't ignore it. You've got to get people around the table. You've got to get people talking about it. You've got to get some kind of solution to it. In places like Scotland, they've solved it. And they've solved it in a way to say, look, we accept this, acknowledging the problem to start with. That goes a long way to actually accepting actually what's happened and what the problem is. And saying, look, we can't solve it overnight, but we'll try and get back on a pathway to solving it, which I think is what's happened with the consultants in England, but not with the junior doctors in England. So, yeah, it's going to have to be addressed, because otherwise this problem goes on. And it's not just a problem in terms of the industrial action. It's not just let's have strikes for 5 days and the chaos that's going to cause. It's something Matthew talked about earlier in terms of productivity. Probably one of the most driving factors why perhaps NHS productivity hasn't been as good, is if you don't pay people very well, they're going to be less motivated. They're going to start working to rule. Then they're going to start doing all those free bits, those extra bits they used to do. They're going to stop doing them, which I think probably has happened to a certain extent. And so fundamentally, if you don't reward people properly, they will start drifting off.
100%, right? So I was on strike as a junior doctor in 2016, and to Andy's point, the NHS runs on the goodwill and professionalism of its staff. Like, all of us stay that extra bit, go that extra mile for patients. You could argue that's part of being a professional. I would argue that when it's repeated and endemic, it's just a route to burnout and just not treating your staff very well at all. But in that 2016 strike, where the contract was opposed by Jeremy Hunt on junior doctors, the main outcome for me was a ridiculous loss of goodwill. Like, suddenly people were exception reporting. It's like, my shift finished at 5, I'm going to exception report and claim back the half an hour. I'd never seen that happen pre-2016. After 2016, I think the goodwill completely evaporated. I think the goodwill in the NHS right now is running at an all-time low because of the way that the NHS has been treating its staff. And so I think that's an excellent point, that the goodwill has gone. And of course that's affected the productivity, because NHS staff are doing the work that they're paid to. And maybe they're not going the extra mile that they used to, because it was just too often. I don't know, maybe that's unfair. What do you think?
Well, I was going to say one of the issues here is that it snowballs, right? So for those who either aren't leaving the NHS or aren't on strike, it makes it that much worse for those who remain. And there's no help coming. I mean, I guess you can use locums, but if you want another dismal fact, I'll do a little bow. It's my reputation now, but something like 1 out of 11 posts are filled in the NHS at the minute. So it just snowballs, and the more people that leave, and it's understandable. There's no blame on anyone here. It's not even particularly blame on the NHS, really. It's partly, but with the funding, what can you do, really? Just create a breeding ground for a kind of a pretty bad environment. I know, Cyra, you might be able to speak to some of that. But yeah, it just snowballs, and it just makes it so much worse for those who remain.
Cyra looks to have frozen in a particularly unhappy face, which is fair enough. I think to your point there, yeah, I forgot what I was going to say. I got distracted.
I think the goodwill is definitely gone, and these strikes are, fewer and fewer people are willing to work on the strikes as well, because they understand that it's undermining them. But also the strikes are almost like a break that people don't normally get because of things being so tight. There's no slack in the rota. There's no, like, trying to get leave that you're entitled to is so difficult that actually the strikes are almost a way of trying to take a breath and try and avoid burnout, because that's where people are at the moment.
Yeah, I remembered, absolutely. What I was going to say is that Matthew mentioned the recruitment statistics of the NHS. If, as an organisation, you can't recruit people do not want to come and work for you, right? That is a really, really bad sign, okay? And the NHS has a massive recruitment issue, which means that the pay and working conditions inside that organisation are so bad that highly trained professionals, many who have trained their entire lives to perform the roles that they do, healthcare workers, they don't want to come and work for you. So that is a very bad sign if you're an organisation. And cheery economist in the corner there has backed that up with some statistics. So, okay, this is a bad note to end. Oh, Matthew, give us some good news. Come on.
Actually, well, maybe. I mean, I don't know if this is specifically for the elections, but I wanted to get what you guys are thinking. But a lot of the kind of sources I've been reading up on, becoming miserable as a result, but a lot of the sources indicate that a way forward for the NHS might be to pivot from hospital care, the cure aspect, to community-based services, so the prevention. I mean, obviously I'm not a medical professional, but is there anything we can say about that?
Do you want me to jump in? I think that's been said for, this is where the old person comes in. The amount of times I've heard this over the years is great. The problem is then politics kicks in. Okay, and to be honest, you've got to shrink. You do need to shrink secondary care or grow primary care compared with secondary care. But you try and close a small district general hospital in a constituency that's a marginal constituency for an MP, and I can assure you it's near enough impossible to do that, because the politics kicks in, of the local politics kicks in. I just look at where I am locally. We've got 3 hospitals in my area, because it's a vast rural area, but actually you can't afford 3 hospitals. What it really needs is probably 2 hospitals, but You close one of those three, it's going to be a massive problem. So, yeah, I mean, if we can move towards health prevention, it will hopefully bring demand down. You probably look at where the demand is at the moment in primary care. The demand is coming partly because the waiting lists are so ridiculously high that people don't get well just sitting on a waiting list. They get more unwell, so they have to be seen more times, they have to be managed more. You've got that factor, you've got the dentistry factor, which I know general practice doesn't deal with dentistry, but if people are in pain, they've got to turn somewhere. You've got the social care factor that impacts in terms of general practice. So all these kind of things around it pushes demand towards it. If you can start dealing with those demand levels in a more proactive way, it should help. But politically, it's quite a hard step to make.
Yeah, and as with most things in economics, the theory is nicer than reality. So I'll leave it there with my economist ways.
Thanks for your economist input during this, I think, Matthew. Okay, so that's our kind of take on this. If you're watching on YouTube, I'd love to hear your comments on what else you would like to see in the manifesto, and what do you think about what we've said today, which are just the opinions of the individuals concerned. But what I wanted to do at the end is, we talked about 5 things broadly, right? We talked about fixing pay and industrial action. We talked about lifetime allowance. We've talked about marginal rates of tax. We're talking about the frozen allowances that's led to the fiscal drag / stealth taxation. And we opened up by talking about student loans. If you could choose only one of those, which one would you choose and why? And I'm going to put Andy on the spot first, then I'll go to Matthew, and then I'll go to Cyra.
So I would look at student loan forgiveness for people working in key industries, because actually I think we need to support our younger workers now who have got the most rawest deal out of where things have gone in the economy over the past few years, and that's what I would be looking at.
Cool. Over to me. I think for me, one of the biggest things economy-wide and specifically in the NHS is investment pledges for investment into staff, into buildings, into medical equipment. It's just falling far too low, and I think increasing those sorts of productivity ways for investment will make it easier and more manageable across the whole system.
I would like the tax rate bands to move, so it pays to work. So hard work needs to pay off.
Yeah, I was torn between student loans and fixing industrial action. I thought about it long and hard, and I'm going to say fix industrial action, specifically for the junior doctors. This has been rumbling on for so long. I just think that the demands are reasonable. Come on, let's just fix that. And I think if Andy's correct and we do get a Labour government, I can't see a Labour government having a major union on strike for too long into their reign. But yeah, that's what I'd like to. So let us know what you think in the comments. Such great to catch up at this early morning session. And as I say, we did record this before the manifestos are officially released, although they've been widely leaked. And this podcast might date really, really badly if any of our predictions are wrong. But we'll see. Matthew, get editing because we need to release this ASAP. But thanks so much. Don't forget to hit the like button, the subscribe button. What else should I say at the end, Matthew?
The bell, the little bell thing YouTubers always say to get notifications about new videos, but only if you want.
Bell. Okay, awesome. And look forward to catching up with you on the next episode. Thanks for your time, everyone.
Cheers all. I'm going back to bed.
Thank you.